The dawn of March 31st, 2026, broke over London with an atmosphere so cold it felt suffocating. The black gates of Buckingham Palace stood motionless as always. The guards still changed shifts to the sound of boots striking the stone courtyard. But behind the thick glass windows of that ancient palace, a silent purge had already been completed. And this time, the target was not a politician, nor a rebellious figure in Parliament, but Prince Harry himself, once considered the most beloved grandson of Queen Elizabeth II. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, London time, British media outlets simultaneously received a 64-page document. There was no lengthy explanation, no familiar royal ceremony, just a cold message sent like a gunshot fired straight across the Atlantic to Montecito, California. And according to multiple internal sources, that moment left Harry completely shattered. One former royal aide described him as shaking while reading the opening lines. Another used only one word: blindsided, caught off guard before he could even react. While the world still believed Harry and Meghan were enjoying a luxurious and carefree life along the California coast, in London, Princess Anne was reportedly quietly completing what many insiders called a financial death sentence against her own nephew. The shock was not in the amount of money being cut off, but in the ruthless conclusion buried inside the report itself. Harry was not viewed as the mastermind. He was described as a manipulated piece on the board, a sacrificial pawn in a much larger power struggle than the public had ever imagined. But the question now shaking Britain was this: what happened behind the closed doors of Windsor that transformed a woman as famously private and loyal as Princess Anne into the architect of an unprecedented strike against her own royal bloodline? And more importantly, if Harry truly was only a pawn, then who was really controlling this ruthless game from the shadows? That is where today's story begins. If the 64-page report was the opening shot that shook Montecito, then the name appearing most frequently throughout the file was not Harry, nor Meghan. It was Margaret Hartley, a 72-year-old woman with silver hair, always tied neatly behind her head, who had served for more than 30 years in the Internal Financial Oversight Division of the British royal household. Inside Buckingham administration circles, Margaret was so respected she had become almost legendary. She never appeared before the media, never gave interviews, never participated in public controversies. And precisely because of that, the moment her name appeared in the leaked confidential documents, all of London understood this was far more serious than anyone had expected. According to sources close to the palace, everything began with a mistake. So small, almost nobody noticed it. An expense invoice connected to the Sussex media team at the end of 2019 was entered under the wrong payment code. Just one misplaced number. Just one missing verification mark. To most people, it would have looked like an ordinary administrative error. But to Margaret Hartley, a woman known for her obsession with detail, it resembled a tiny crack forming inside an ancient stone wall, and she began pulling at the first thread. At first, the review was only intended to verify internal accounting procedures, but the deeper Margaret investigated, the more unusual financial transactions she discovered surrounding Harry and Meghan's public activities: payments for international image services, consulting fees for post-royal brand development, media contracts signed with companies sharing overlapping registration addresses in Delaware, the Cayman Islands, and the British Virgin Islands. Then she saw the number that pushed the entire investigation into another dimension: £25,000. That money was transferred into an account located in the Virgin Islands just 48 hours after Archie's christening. At the time, the global public was emotionally moved by images of the Sussex family carrying their first son inside Windsor Chapel. Newspapers called it a healing moment for the royal family after months of tension, but behind the scenes, according to the documents Margaret gathered, a secret financial transaction had quietly unfolded almost simultaneously. What infuriated her was not merely the amount itself. For Buckingham, £25,000 was hardly a significant sum. What kept Margaret awake night after night was the pattern repeating behind it. After every television appearance where Harry and Meghan spoke about royal pressure, another payment emerged. After every emotional interview, another consulting company appeared. After every wave of public controversy, another offshore account recorded incoming transfers. A former employee in the financial department later recalled Margaret slamming a file onto the table and speaking in a voice trembling with anger. Public service is not something to be sold one tear at a time. That was the moment she began believing the issue was no longer about personal spending or isolated media contracts. In Margaret Hartley's eyes, the entire rebellious image against the monarchy had slowly transformed into a carefully calculated business model, cold enough to send chills through the palace itself. According to leaked sources, she spent nearly 8 months tracing the network of shell companies connected to intermediary figures surrounding the Sussex household. Some companies existed for only a few months before disappearing. Others listed legal directors who specialized in managing international assets for America's ultra-wealthy elite. Most striking of all was the timing. Many transactions appeared immediately after major media events directly tied to Harry and Meghan's royal victim image. The deeper Margaret investigated, the more haunted she became by one question. Did Harry truly understand the full financial structure operating around him? One former senior advisor said that during confidential meetings, Margaret rarely criticized Harry with hatred. What she expressed more often was disappointment. In her view, Harry had been born into an environment that protected him too much. He was accustomed to others cleaning up the consequences for him. And that, she believed, made him the perfect target for people who fully understood the commercial power of a royal title. The leaked documents also revealed that Margaret paid particular attention to the moment Harry and Meghan announced their departure from the royal family in early 2020. In her assessment, the plan was not a spontaneous reaction driven by emotional pain. As the public once believed, it resembled a strategy prepared long in advance, complete with legal structures, corporate systems, and financial channels already built and waiting for the moment of activation. That was also the moment the atmosphere inside Buckingham began to change completely. At first, many senior officials wanted to bury the matter quietly to avoid another scandal for the monarchy. But Margaret fiercely opposed the idea. She believed that if the palace continued hiding the truth, Buckingham itself would become complicit in turning the very image of public service, the image Queen Elizabeth II had spent her entire life protecting, into a commercial product. According to one internal source, Margaret once stood in the middle of a meeting room and delivered a sentence that left everyone completely silent. The taxpayers do not support the royal family just to watch loyalty transformed into a global entertainment brand. It was no longer the anger of a financial employee. It was the outrage of someone who had spent an entire lifetime believing in the concept of royal duty, only to suddenly realize that everything might have been turned into a machine for profit behind the glow of media spotlights. But the most frightening revelation had not yet appeared. Because the deeper Margaret dug into the legal network surrounding Meghan, the more she discovered an extraordinarily sophisticated structure. Layers of intermediary companies, agreements designed to shield personal liability, clauses that made tracing actual control nearly impossible. And at the center of that maze, Harry did not appear to be the one in command. He stood on the front line, facing public opinion, facing the press, facing the royal family. But behind him, Legal walls had been constructed so carefully that nobody else would have to absorb the direct impact, and it was at that moment Margaret Hartley realized something that sent a chill through her body. Money was only the outer shell. What was far more terrifying was the way Meghan was believed to have built a legal fortress where Harry had been pushed onto the battlefield without even a piece of armor to protect himself. When Margaret Hartley first said, during a confidential meeting, that Harry may be the only one who falls if everything explodes, many people inside Buckingham thought she was exaggerating. After all, in the public eye, Harry and Meghan always appeared as a united front. They left the royal family together, signed media contracts together, gave explosive interviews together, built their post-royal empire together in California. If financial misconduct or legal disputes ever emerged, the public naturally assumed they would share the consequences equally. But the deeper Margaret examined the legal files, the more she uncovered a chilling reality. On paper, Harry and Meghan were not standing on the same side the way everyone believed, and that was the most brilliant deception of all. According to leaked documents from the internal investigation team, most of the asset structures connected to the Sussex post-royal brand had been organized through an extraordinarily complex legal maze in California. Intellectual property rights, media brands, image licensing rights, content agreements, and several family trust funds were not directly registered under Meghan Markle's name. Instead, they were connected to legal entities whose ultimate beneficiaries were Archie and Lilibet. At first glance, it looked like a standard decision among America's ultra-wealthy families, parents transferring assets to their children in order to optimize taxes and protect inheritance. But according to experts consulted by Margaret, the structure carried another meaning far more disturbing, because Archie and Lilibet were minors. The actual control over the trusts and assets connected to them rested almost entirely in the hands of the primary guardian. And in California, that position belonged to Meghan. In other words, if one day the entire financial system surrounding the Sussex household collapsed under lawsuits in Britain, Meghan could still preserve the core of the family wealth through what insiders called the children's shield. While Harry became the one absorbing the full legal impact, that was when Margaret returned to review documents dating back to 2019, and she discovered something that left the entire Buckingham meeting room speechless. In many operational records connected to Sussex activities in Britain before the couple officially stepped away from royal duties, the person signing legal responsibility was not Meghan. It was Harry. From paperwork related to media organizations and sponsorship operations to administrative decisions connected to official royal image management. The name appearing most frequently in the legal confirmation position was Prince Harry himself. Under British law, especially in financial disputes involving operational liability and disclosure obligations, the person signing the documents is often the first one summoned before a court, and that was the real nightmare. An anonymous legal advisor who once worked with the royal family said Harry behaved like a traditional royal. He signed documents out of instinctive duty, trusted the people around him, and never truly questioned the long-term consequences. But the world Meghan came from operated very differently. Hollywood does not function on trust. It functions through contracts, liability waivers, and legal protection layers established long before any crisis begins. That was why many people inside Buckingham started viewing the entire Sussex story through a different lens. Perhaps Harry genuinely believed he was fighting to protect his wife and children from media pressure. Perhaps he believed he was resisting the same cold institution that once hurt his mother. But while Harry appeared before cameras, driven by raw emotion, an extremely disciplined financial and legal structure was quietly being built around Meghan and the children behind the scenes. One internal source described it with a sentence that frightened everyone who heard it. Harry rushed into war with his heart. Meghan entered with an escape map. The deeper Margaret investigated, the more she realized Harry was almost the only face still directly tied to responsibilities inside Britain. His royal title created commercial value. His signature opened doors to contracts. His rebellion generated media attention. But those same things also made him the perfect target if the Crown Estate or financial oversight bodies ever decided to pursue legal action. And that risk was not small. According to legal experts mentioned in the report, if a formal investigation were launched regarding the commercial use of royal status while still performing public duties, Harry could face enormous civil compensation claims. Not just financial destruction. Whatever remained of his reputation in Britain could be completely crushed. The most bitter part was that Meghan appeared almost nowhere on the front line of those liabilities. She was not the person signing most British documents in 2019. She also was not directly listed as the owner of many core asset structures in the United States. Technically, most future value had been anchored to trusts and benefits connected to Archie and Lilibet. In other words, if a legal explosion ever occurred, Harry could lose everything. While Meghan still retained the financial foundation, protecting herself and the children, that information spread through palace corridors like an earthquake. Some people began looking at Harry with anger. They believed he had betrayed his family, sold royal prestige for profit, and therefore deserved whatever consequences followed. But others, for the first time, began feeling sympathy for him, because if what Margaret discovered was true, Harry had not only rebelled against the monarchy, he might also have walked directly into a trap whose full structure he never truly understood. A former communications secretary later recalled that after reading the legal analysis, one elderly palace official quietly muttered, he thought he was protecting his family. But on paper, he became the human shield. That sentence sent chills through many inside the palace. Because when people looked back at Harry's entire journey after the wedding, the pattern seemed to appear everywhere. Harry was the one confronting the press. Harry was the one attacking the family in interviews. Harry was the one delivering emotional statements in documentaries. Harry was the one writing a memoir exposing internal royal conflicts. Meanwhile, Meghan increasingly moved deeper into the role of producer, strategist, brand architect, and controller of the business system operating behind the scenes. And it was precisely that shift which convinced Margaret Hartley that this was not simply an emotional marriage. It was a power structure designed with extraordinary precision. According to leaked sources, Margaret spent countless hours analyzing every legal layer surrounding the companies connected to the Sussex network. She paid particular attention to the way many intellectual property rights had been registered in forms almost impossible to directly impact through disputes originating in Britain. That alone suggested the architects of the system had planned far ahead. Not for a few months, possibly for many years. The question spreading through royal observer circles was no longer whether Harry and Meghan had profited from royal fame. The real question became who had prepared an escape route in advance, and who would be left standing alone in the middle of the battlefield when everything collapsed. The image of Harry shaking on the morning of March 31st suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. Perhaps for the first time, he understood that legal documents do not care about love, emotional pain, or loyalty. They care only about where the signatures are placed. And most of those signatures carried Harry's name. For years, the public had been told a very simple story. A prince fell in love with the woman he chose and fought against the world to protect her. But behind that modern fairy tale, Margaret Hartley believed another story existed. One far colder, a story about power, assets, calculation, and survival among the global elite. Was Meghan a wife who loved her husband enough to sacrifice everything for him? Or was she a cold strategist who prepared her own escape route from the very first day she entered the British royal family? To answer that question, one had to look toward the only woman inside Windsor strong enough not to be shaken by emotion: Princess Anne, the Iron Woman of the monarchy, and the way she began a purge that left Buckingham gripped with fear. Ladies and gentlemen, for decades, the British royal family survived scandals that at times seemed capable of destroying the entire monarchy itself. Affairs, private recordings, broken marriages, media wars lasting for years. From the era of Princess Diana to the controversial relationship between King Charles and Camilla, Windsor repeatedly stood at the edge of losing public trust. But according to those who understood how the palace truly functioned, all of those scandals shared one common element. They were scandals rooted in human emotion. Human beings fall in love with the wrong people. Human beings betray. Human beings are weak. The monarchy could forgive weakness. But what Princess Anne could never forgive was the transformation of the very system built to serve the crown into a machine for personal profit. That was why many sources said the atmosphere inside Buckingham changed completely the moment Margaret Hartley presented her final findings. It was no longer irritation toward a rebellious couple, no longer disappointment over interviews attacking the family. For the first time, senior officials began using a far more dangerous word: system. According to one internal security employee, at exactly 9 o'clock that evening, Princess Anne arrived at the eastern financial offices of the palace without any prior warning. No large entourage, no royal ceremony, only a red file she carried in her own hands. Those present later recalled that Anne showed almost no emotion at all. But it was precisely that coldness which made the entire room tense with fear. She immediately ordered an emergency meeting involving legal advisors, financial specialists, and representatives from the Crown Estate. The meeting lasted more than 4 hours behind closed doors. Personal phones were required to remain outside. Nobody was permitted to record anything. Several staff members later said they had not seen security measures that extreme since the death of Queen Elizabeth II, and then the order was given. Lockdown. Seal every financial office connected to Sussex records from 2018 through 2020. Internal servers were locked. Paper files were sealed. Accounts previously granted access to sensitive documents were temporarily disabled. According to one source, Anne wanted to guarantee that no additional records could disappear or be altered before the review was complete. That was the moment many inside Buckingham realized Princess Anne had decided to turn this into a true purge. To the international public, Anne was often viewed as the driest figure within the royal family. No glamorous fashion like Diana. No modern image like Catherine. No inspirational speeches. But inside Windsor, she carried a very different nickname: the Iron Woman. Anne was raised in a generation that believed a royal title was not a privilege for making money. It was a duty. She worked herself to exhaustion for decades, with almost no complaints. No emotional interviews. No selling private stories to the media. And because of that, when she looked at the financial structure surrounding the Sussex household, she did not see a wounded couple. She saw betrayal against the core philosophy of the crown itself. According to leaked sources, during that 4-hour meeting, several advisors still attempted to argue that Harry may have been manipulated or too naive to fully understand the legal system operating around him. But Anne immediately cut them off. Naivety does not create networks of shell companies. This is strategy. That sentence spread through palace corridors within hours. And for many people, it marked the exact moment Anne stripped away the final excuse, still protecting Harry. Because for years, many members of the royal family still wanted to believe Harry was simply an impulsive man guided by emotion, a wounded child after the death of his mother. a rebellious prince, blinded by love for his wife. But Anne did not view the matter through family emotion. She viewed it through the logic of the institution. From her perspective, cross-border transactions, layered legal protections for assets, complex intellectual property structures, and carefully distributed financial liability could not appear by accident simply because of an emotional marriage. It required planning, it required strategy, and most importantly, it required intent. That difference was precisely why Anne viewed the Sussex scandal as even more serious than the Camilla crisis years earlier. According to a veteran royal advisor, Anne once said during a private meeting that although the relationship between Charles and Camilla caused devastating pain to Diana, it was still a personal tragedy between human beings. But with the Sussex situation, the issue had evolved into a systemic threat. The monarchy was no longer being endangered by emotion, but by the commercialization of the very power structure of the crown itself. That was an entirely different level. Some people even began comparing the situation to the financial crises that once destroyed European aristocratic dynasties, where private greed slowly eroded the legitimacy of entire institutions. What angered Anne most was the way children had been placed at the center of the asset structure. In her eyes, Archie and Lilibet should have been protected from every media war and every legal conflict. But within the documents Margaret Hartley collected, the names of the two children appeared like sophisticated financial shields. One source recalled that Anne remained silent for a very long time while reading that section. Then she slowly placed the file on the table and spoke quietly. Children should not become legal vaults. The room reportedly fell completely silent after those words. From that moment onward, Buckingham's approach changed dramatically. No more prioritizing family reconciliation. No more gentle phone calls trying to bring Harry back into the fold. The focus now became protecting the Crown estate, protecting the royal financial system, and preventing any loophole from being exploited again in the future. According to internal sources, Anne personally ordered a review of every remaining legal connection between Harry and organizations within Britain. She also demanded a complete assessment of litigation risks if any transactions were judged to involve the use of royal status for personal commercial gain. That was when fear began spreading beyond Buckingham and directly toward California. Because while Anne tightened every link in London, the first cracks reportedly began appearing within the Sussex alliance itself. According to a source close to American media circles, Harry started asking questions he had never asked before. Which documents carried whose name? Who controlled the trusts? What would happen if international lawsuits emerged? And why most of the legal responsibility in Britain was tied solely to his signature? Those questions came too late. Because the system had already been operating for years, and the more documents that were dragged beneath Anne's cold investigative spotlight, the more the fairy tale marriage carefully built in Montecito began to fracture. It was no longer simply a story about love standing against the monarchy, no longer a symbol of freedom from rigid royal tradition. Gradually, it transformed into a story about power, money, and the survival instincts of the modern elite. According to longtime royal observers, the most frightening thing about Princess Anne was not her anger. It was the fact that once Anne believed the crown itself was under threat, she would never stop halfway. And this time, the objective was no longer protecting the family's reputation. The objective was saving the entire system from what she believed had been a calculated model of exploitation from the very beginning. As Anne's cold light of scrutiny reached deeper and deeper, alliances in California reportedly began to collapse layer by layer. And for the first time in 7 years, Harry began asking questions he should have asked from the very first day he walked out through the gates of Buckingham Palace. By the beginning of the spring of 2026, the thing frightening Harry most was no longer the British press, nor the silent investigations unfolding inside Buckingham. The most terrifying thing now was silence. Silence from London. Silence from the people who once called him the People's Prince. And the growing cold silence inside the massive mansion in Montecito itself. According to leaked polling at the time, more than 72% of the British public said they no longer trusted Harry. The number felt less like a public opinion survey and more like a spiritual sentence. Only a few years earlier, he had been the most beloved member of the royal family after Queen Elizabeth II. People once saw Harry as the closest reflection of Diana herself, a rebellious but sincere prince, a man who knew how to laugh, how to suffer, how to remain human inside the rigid machinery of monarchy. But now, that image had almost completely collapsed. British television programs began referring to him as the exiled prince. Some conservative commentators even argued that Harry had lost the most valuable thing any Windsor could possess: the trust of the public. The bitter irony was that even in America, once viewed as the promised land for the Sussexes' new life, the doors also appeared to be slowly closing. The contracts once celebrated as symbols of Harry and Meghan's victory after leaving the monarchy gradually became subjects of ridicule. Netflix was reportedly disappointed by the unstable commercial performance of projects following the initial media explosion. Spotify ended its partnership amid visible tension. And then Bill Simmons's explosive remark spread across international media like a knife driven straight into the Sussex image. Grifters. Fraud. That was not merely an insult. It was the moment America's media elite began openly turning their backs on them. For years, Harry and Meghan built their brand around the narrative of victimhood. They sold pain, resistance, and the battle against the monarchy as a global product, but the weakness of that model was that it required constantly creating new emotional waves in order to survive. And eventually, the public began growing tired. One former Hollywood media executive observed that audiences can sympathize with pain once, but when every project revolves around retelling the same tragedy through an increasingly commercialized lens, sympathy eventually transforms into suspicion. Harry probably realized that later than everyone else. According to a source close to Montecito real estate circles, during that period, Harry was often seen wandering alone around the massive estate. No entourage, no close military friends from his past, no regular trips back to London as before. He walked for hours through the gardens behind the property, almost completely avoiding major social events in California. One person who encountered Harry during that time described him as a man trying to remember who he used to be. That may have been Harry's real tragedy. In Britain, he no longer belonged to the royal family the way he once had. But in America, he never truly belonged to the Hollywood world Meghan understood so well. Harry was born inside a structure where his identity was inseparable from the crown. Strip away that layer, and he remained famous, but without foundations beneath him. And even more frightening was the realization that the financial structure surrounding him was not truly under his control either. The documents reviewed by Princess Anne and her legal team reportedly triggered a dangerous chain reaction. Harry was said to have begun questioning the true ownership behind the assets, trusts, and branding systems built over the years. But the answers he received did not appear reassuring, because the closer Harry looked, the more he saw his own name attached to the most dangerous places. Liability documents, operational records, legal signatures in Britain. Meanwhile, the long-term core assets were anchored inside structures he could barely control directly. One source, who previously worked with international legal teams, made a cold observation. Harry has the reputation to sell, but he does not hold the keys to the vault. That was the moment the phrase collateral damage reportedly began appearing in private conversations around Buckingham. Unintended damage, or more precisely, the person sacrificed so that the larger plan could survive. Some people still believe Meghan truly loved Harry, but even those defending her most fiercely struggle to deny that the entire legal structure surrounding Sussex was built in a way that minimized risk for Meghan and the children far more than for Harry. And that made his tragedy more bitter than ever. Harry traded his family, his homeland, blood relationships, and even his place in royal history to protect a new life in California. Yet now he stood inside a multi-million-dollar mansion while resembling a man who did not truly own anything at all. No road back to London. No real sense of belonging in America. No longer wearing the image of the beloved prince the public once adored, and perhaps most painfully of all, no longer certain that the woman he fought the world to protect had entered that battle with the same level of sacrifice he had made. People who knew Harry in his younger years often said he feared one thing above all else: being left alone. After Diana's death, that fear only deepened. Harry hated the feeling of betrayal, isolation, and becoming an outsider inside his own family. Ironically, years later, he now appeared to be facing that exact nightmare in a place thousands of miles away from London. Montecito had sunshine, ocean views, and the luxury the press once celebrated endlessly. But behind the white walls and towering palm trees, the image of a dream of freedom was slowly transforming into a golden cage for an exiled prince. A man finally realizing that in the world of global power games, love alone was never enough to protect someone who did not understand the rules. In the end, after all the tearful interviews, the explosive documentaries, the accusations that shook Buckingham, and the long trail of financial secrets exposed to the public, what remained was not merely the collapse of a family relationship. What now stood before the public eye was a far greater conflict, a battle between personal emotion and the survival of an institution thousands of years old. And in that battle, Princess Anne delivered the coldest and clearest message since the Sussex crisis began. The crown cannot be compromised. To Anne, loyalty was not a slogan for television cameras. It was discipline, responsibility, the willingness to place duty above personal interest, even when that meant members of her own bloodline would pay the price. That was why she stood at the front line of this unprecedented financial purge, despite the fact that the person most directly affected was her own nephew. But what captured the attention of royal observers even more than Anne's toughness was the rare unity forming between King Charles, Prince William, and Princess Anne. After years of criticism, accusing Windsor of being slow, outdated, and trapped in the past, the monarchy now seemed to be entering an entirely new phase, more transparent, more disciplined, and willing to cut away any link viewed as a threat to the legitimacy of the crown. Perhaps Harry's greatest tragedy was not losing his place within the monarchy. Perhaps it was realizing one truth far too late. While love can change human emotions, the legacy of an institution like the British royal family operates according to principles far less vulnerable to personal feeling. And that may also be the final lesson left behind by today's story. Palaces can shake under scandal. Kings can face criticism. Marriages can collapse. But for Windsor, the one thing that must survive at any cost is the crown itself. And what about you? Do you believe Harry is a tragic victim swept into a power game far bigger than himself? Or do you believe he fully deserves the fate he faces today for turning his back on his family and his duty? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We will read every single response from all of you.